It Can't Happen Here, Chapter 12. I shall not be content till this country can produce every single thing we need, even coffee, cocoa, and rubber, and so keep all our dollars at home. If we can do this and at the same time work up tourist traffic so that foreigners will come from every part of the world to see such remarkable wonders as the Grand Canyon, Glacier, and Yellowstone, etc. parks, the fine hotels of Chicago, and etc., thus leaving their money here, we shall have such a balance of trade as will go far to carry out my often criticized yet completely sound idea of from $300,000 to $5,000 per year for every single family. That is, every real American family. Such an aspiring vision is what we want, and not all this nonsense of wasting our time at Geneva and talky talk at Lugano, whatever that is. From Zero Hour by Brasilius Windrip. Election Day would fall on Tuesday, November 3rd, and on Sunday evening of the 1st, Senator Windrip played the finale of his campaign at a mass meeting in Madison Square Garden in New York. The garden would hold, with seats in the standing room, about 19,000, and a week before the meeting, every ticket had been sold at from 50 cents to $5, and then by speculators resold at from $1 to 20. Doremus had been able to get one single ticket from an acquaintance, one of the Hearst dailies, which alone among the New York papers were supporting Windrip, and on the afternoon of November 1st, he traveled the 300 miles to New York for his first visit in 3 years. It had been cold in Vermont with early snow, but the white drifts lay to the earth so quietly in an unstained air that the world seemed a silver-painted carnival left to silence. Even on a moonless light, a pale radiance came from the snow and from the earth itself, and the stars were drops of quicksilver. But following the red cap carrying his shabby Gladstone bag, Doremus came out of the Grand Central at 6 o'clock into the gray trickle of a cold dishwater from Heaven's kitchen sink. The renowned towers which he expected to see on 42nd Street were dead in the crummy mummy cloths of ragged fog. And as to the mob that, with the cruel disinterest, galloped past him, a new and heedless smear of faces every second, the man from Fort Beulah could think only that New York must be holding its county fair in this clammy drizzle, or else there was a big fire somewhere. He had sensibly planned to save money by using the subway, the substantial village burghers so poor in the city of Babylonian guardians. And he even remembered that there were still to be found in Manhattan 5-cent trolley cars in which a rustic might divert himself by looking at sailors and poets and shawled women from the steeps of the Kazakhstan. To the red cap he had piped with what he conceived to be traveled urbanity, "Guess I'll take the trolley just a few blocks," but deafened and dizzied by and elbow-jabbed by the crowd, soaked and depressed, he took refuge in a taxi, then wished he hadn't as he saw the slippery rubber-colored pavement, and as his taxi got wedged among other cars stinking of carbon monoxide and frenzied tooting for release from the jam, a huddle of robot sheep bleating their terror with mechanical lungs of 100 horsepower. He painfully hesitated before going out again from his small hotel in the West 40s, and when he muddily crept along among the shrill shop girls, the weary chorus girls, the hard cigarette-clamping gamblers, and the pretty young men on Broadway, he felt himself, with rubbers and umbrella which Emma had forced upon him, a very Casper milk-toast. He most noticed a number of stray imitation soldiers without sidearms or rifles, but in a uniform like that of an American cavalryman of 1870, slant-topped blue forage caps, dark blue tunics, light blue trousers with yellow stripes at the seam, tucked into leggings of black rubberoid for what appeared to be the privates, and boots of sleek black leather for officers. Each of them had on the right side of his collar the letters MM, and on the left a 5-pointed star. There were so many of them, they swaggered so brazenly, shouldering civilians out of the way, and upon insignificances like Doremus they looked with frigid insolence. He suddenly understood. These young condottieri were the Minutemen, the private troops of Brasilius Windrip, about which Doremus had been publishing uneasy news reports. He was thrilled and a little dismayed to see them now, the printed words made brutal flesh. 3 weeks ago, Winthrop had announced that Colonel Dewey Hake had founded, just for the campaign, a nationwide league of Winthrop marching clubs to be called the Minutemen. It was probable that they had been in formation for months, since already they had 3,000 or 4,000 members. Dreamus was afraid the MMs might become a permanent organization more menacing than the Ku Klux Klan. Their uniform suggested the pioneer America of Cold Harbor and of Indian fighters under Miles and Custer. Their emblem, their swastika, and here Dreamus saw the cunning and mysticism of Lee Saracen, was a 5-pointed star, because the star on the American flag was 5-pointed, whereas the stars of both the Soviet banner and the Jews, the Shield of David, were 6-pointed. The fact that the Soviet star actually was also 5-pointed, no one noticed during these excited days of regeneration. Anyway, it was a nice idea to have this star simultaneously challenge the Jews and the Bolsheviks, and the M&Ms had good intentions, even if their symbolism did slip a little. Yet the craftiest thing about the M&Ms was that they wore no colored shirts, but only plain white when on parade, and light khaki when on outpost duty, so that Buzz Winthrop could thunder and frequently, "Black shirts, brown shirts, red shirts, yes, and maybe cowbrindle shirts, all these degenerate European uniforms of tyranny. No, sir, the Minutemen are not fascist or communist or anything at all, but plain democratic, the knight champions of the rights of the forgotten men, the shock troops of freedom." Dreamus dined on Chinese food, his invariable self-indulgence when he was in a large city without Emma, who stated that the chow mein was nothing but fried Excelsior and flour-taste gravy. He forgot the leering troopers a little. He was happy in glancing at the gilded wood carvings, at the octagonal lanterns painted with doll-like Chinese peasants crossing arch bridges, at a quartet of guests, 2 male and 2 female, who looked like public enemies and who, all through dinner, quarreled with restrained viciousness. When he headed toward Madison Square Garden in the culminating Winthrop rally, he was plunged into a maelstrom. A whole nation seemed querulously to be headed the same way. He could not get a taxicab, and walking through the dreary storm some 14 blocks to Madison Square Garden, he was aware of the murderous temper of the crowd. 8th Avenue, lined with cheap jack shops, was packed with drab, discouraged people who yet tonight were tipsy with the hashish of hope. They filled the sidewalks, nearly filled the pavement, while irritable motors squeezed tediously through them, and angry policemen were pushed and whirled about, and if they tried to be haughty, got jeered at by lively shopgirls. Through the welter, before Dreamus's eyes, jabbed a flying wedge of Minutemen, led by what he was later to recognize as a coronet of MMs. They were not on duty, and they were not belligerent. They were cheering and singing Berzelius Winthrop Went to Wash, reminding Dreamus of a slightly drunken knot of students from an inferior college after a football victory. He was to remember them so afterward, months afterwards, when the eminent enemies of the MMs all through the country derisively called them Mickey Mouses and Minnies. An old man, shabbily neat, stood blocking them and yelled, "To hell with Buzz! 3 cheers for FDR!" The MMs burst into hoodlum wrath. The cornet in command, a bruiser uglier even than Shad Ledoux, hit the old man in the jaw, and he sloped down sickeningly. Then, from nowhere, facing the cornet, there was a chief petty officer of the Navy, big, smiling, reckless. The CPO bellowed in a voice turned to hurricanes, "Swell bunch of tin soldiers, 9 of ya to 1 grandpappy, just about even." The cornet socked him. He laid out the cornet with 1 foul to the belly. Instantly, the other 8 MMs were on the CPO, like sparrows after a hawk, and he crashed, his face suddenly veal white, laced with rivulets of blood. The 8 kicked him in the head with their thick marching shoes. They were still kicking him when Dreamus wiggled away, very sick, altogether helpless. He had not turned away quickly enough to avoid seeing an MM trooper, girlish-faced, crimson-lipped, fawn-eyed, throw himself on the fallen cornet and, whimpering, stroke that roustabout's roast-beef cheeks with shy gardenia petal fingers. There were many arguments, a few private fistfights, and 1 more battle before Dreamus reached the auditorium. A block from it, some 30 MMs, headed by a battalion leader, something between a captain and a major, started raiding a street meeting of communists. A Jewish girl in khaki, her bare head soaked with rain, was beseeching from the elevation of a wheelbarrow, "Fellow travelers, don't just chew the rag and sympathize. Join us now. It's life and death." 20 feet from the communists, a middle-aged man who looked like a social worker was explaining the Jeffersonian Party, recalling the record of President Roosevelt and reviling the communists next door as word-drunk, un-American cranks. Half his audience were people who might be competent voters. Half of them, like half of any group on this evening of tragic fiesta, were cigarette-sniping boys in hand-me-downs. The 30 MMs cheerfully smashed into the communists. The battalion leader reached up, slapped the girl's speaker, dragged her down from the wheelbarrow. His followers casually waded in with fists and blackjacks. Dreamus, more nauseated, feeling more helpless than ever, heard the smack of a blackjack on the temple of a scrawny Jewish intellectual. Amazingly, then, the voice of the rival Jeffersonian leader spiraled up into a scream. "Come on, you! Going to let these hellhounds attack our communist friends now? By God!" With which the mild bookworm leaped into the air, came down squarely upon a fat Mickey Mouse, capsized him, seized his blackjack, took time to kick another MM's shins before rising from the wreck, sprang up and waded into the raiders as Dreamus guessed. He would have waded into a table of statistics on the proportions of butterfat and loose milk in 97.7% of the shops on Avenue B. Till then, only a half-dozen Communist Party members had been facing the MMs, their backs to a garage wall. 50 of their own, 50 Jeffersonians besides, now joined them, and with bricks and umbrellas and deadly volumes of sociology, they drove off the enraged MMs, partisans of Bella Kuhn, side by side with the partisans of Professor John Dewey, until a riot squad of policemen battered their way in to protect the MMs by arresting the girl communist speaker and the Jeffersonian. Dreamus had often headed up sports stories about Madison Square Garden prize fights, but he did not know that the place had nothing to do with Madison Square, from which it was a day's journey by bus, that it was decidedly not a garden, as the fighters there did not fight for prizes, but for fixed partnership shares in the business, and that a good many of them did not fight at all. The mammoth building, as in exhaustion Dreamus crawled up to it, was entirely ringed with MMs, elbow to elbow, all carrying heavy canes, and at every entrance, along every side, the MMs were rigidly in line, with their officers galloping about, whispering orders and bearing uneasy rumors that like scared calves in a dipping pen. These past weeks, hungry miners, dispossessed farmers, Carolina mill hands had greeted Senator Winthrop with a flutter of worn hands beneath gasoline torches. Now he was to face not the unemployed, for they could not afford 50-cent tickets, but the small, scared side-street traders of New York, who considered themselves altogether superior to clodhoppers and mind-creepers, yet were as desperate as they. The swelling mass that Dreamus saw, proud in seats or standing chin to nape in the aisles, in a reek of dampened clothes, was not romantic. They were people concerned with the tailor's goose, the tray of potato salad, the card of hooks and eyes, the leech-like mortgage on their own driven taxi, with, at home, the baby's diapers, the dull safety razor blade, the awful rise in the cost of rump steak and kosher chicken, and a few, and very proud, civil service clerks and letter carriers and superintendents of small apartment houses, curiously fashionable in $17 ready-made suits and feebly stitched foulard ties, who boasted, "I don't know why all these bums go on relief. I may not be such a whiz, but let me tell you, even since 1929, I've never made less than $2,000 a year." Manhattan peasants, kind people, industrious people, generous to their aged, eager to find any desperate cure for sickness of worry over losing the job, the most facile material for any rabble-rouser. The historic rally opened with extreme dullness. A regimental band played the Tales from Hoffman, Barcarolle, and with no apparent significance and not much more liveliness. The Reverend Dr. Henrik van Lollop of St. Apolog's Lutheran Church offered prayer, but one felt that probably it had not been accepted. Senator Porkwood provided a dissertation on Senator Windrip, which was composed in equal parts of apostolic adoration of Buzz and of the uhs with which Honorable Porkwood always interspersed his words. And Windrip wasn't yet even in sight. Colonel Dewey Hake, nominator of Buzz at Cleveland Convention, was considerably better. He told 3 jokes and an anecdote about a faithful carrier pigeon in the Great War, which had seemed to understand really better than many of the human soldiers just why it was that the Americans were over there fighting for France against Germany. The connection of this ornithological hero with the virtues of Senator Windrip did not seem evident, but after having sat under Senator Porkwood, the audience enjoyed the note of military gallantry. Doremus felt that Colonel Hake was not merely rambling, but pounding on towards something definite. His voice became more insistent. He began to talk about Windrip, "My friend, the one man who dares beard the monetary lion, the man who in his great and simple heart cherishes the woe of every common man as once did the brooding tenderness of Abraham Lincoln." Then, wildly waving toward a side entrance, he shrieked, "And here he comes, my friends, Buzz Windrip!" The band hammered out "The Campbells Are Coming," a squadron of Minutemen, smart as horse guards carrying long lances with starred pennants, clipped into the giant bowl of the auditorium, and after them, shabby in an old blue serge suit, nervously twisting a sweat-stained slouched hat, slooped and tired, limped Berzelius Windrip. The audience leaped up, thrusting one another aside, "Have a look at the deliverer," cheering like artillery at dawn. Windrip started prosaically enough, yet you felt rather sorry for him, so awkwardly did he lumber up the steps to the platform, across to the center of the stage. He stopped, stared owlishly, then he quacked monotonously, "The first time I ever came to New York, I was a greenhorn. No, don't laugh, maybe I still am, but I had already been elected a United States Senator, and back home, the way they serenaded me, I thought I was some pumpkins. I thought my name was just about as familiar to everybody as Al Capone's or Camel cigarettes or Castoria. Babies cry for it. But I came to New York on my way to Washington, and say I sat in my hotel lobby here for 3 days, and the only fella ever spoke to me was the hotel detective. And when he did come up and address me, I was tickled to death. I thought he was going to tell me the whole burg was pleased by my condescending to visit them, but all he wanted to know was I a guest in the hotel, and did I have any right to be holding down a lobby chair permanently that way? And tonight, friends, I'm pretty near as scared of old Gotham as I was back then." The laughter, the hand-clapping were fair enough, but the proud electors were disappointed by his drawl, his weary humility. Doremus quivered hopefully. Maybe he isn't going to get elected. Windrip outlined his too familiar platform. Doremus was interested only in observing that Windrip misquoted his own figures regarding the limitation of fortunes in point 5. He slid into a rhapsody of general ideas, a mishmash of polite regards to justice, freedom, equality, order, prosperity, patriotism, and any number of other noble but slippery abstractions. Doremus thought he was being bored until he discovered that at some moment, which he had not noticed, he had become absorbed and excited. Something in the intensity with which Windrip looked at his audience, looked at all of them, his glance slowly taking them in from the highest perched seat to the nearest, convinced them that he was talking to each individual directly and solely, that he wanted to take each of them into his heart, that he was telling them the truths, the imperious and dangerous facts that had been hidden from them. "They say I want money, power. See, I've turned down offers from law firms right here in New York, and 3 times the money I'll get as president. And power? Why, the president is the servant of every citizen in the country, and not just of the considerate folks, but also of every crank that comes pestering him by telegram and phone and letter. And yet it's true, it's absolutely true, I do want power, great big imperial power, but not for myself, no, for you. The power of your permission to smash the Jew financiers who have enslaved you, who are working you to death to pay the interest on their bonds, the grasping bankers, and not all of them Jews by a darn sight, and the Crooked labor leaders just as much as the crooked bosses, and most of all the sneaking spies of Moscow that want you to lick the boots of their self-appointed tyrants that rule not by love and loyalty like I want to, but by the horrible power of the whip, the dark cell, and the automatic pistol. He pictured then a paradise of democracy in which, with the old political machines destroyed, every humblest worker would be king and ruler, dominating representatives elected from among his own kind of people, and these representatives not growing indifferent as hitherto they had done, once they were far off in Washington, but kept alert to the public interest by the supervision of the strengthened executive. It sounded almost reasonable for a while. The supreme actor Buzz Windrip was passionate yet never grotesquely wild. He did not gesture too extravagantly, only, like Gene Debs of old, he reached out a bony finger which seemed to jab into each of them and hook out each heart. It was his mad eyes, big, staring, tragic eyes, that startled them, and his voice, now thundering, now humbly pleading, that soothed them. He was so obviously an honest and merciful leader, a man of sorrows and acquainted with woe. Doremus marveled. "I'll be hanged. Well, he's a darn good sort when you come to meet him, and warm-hearted. He makes me feel as if I've been having a good evening with Buck and Steve Perfix." What if Buzz is right? What if, in spite of all the demagogic pap that I suppose he has got to feed out to the boobs, he's right in claiming that it's only he and not Trowbridge or Roosevelt that can break the hold of the absentee owners? And these Minutemen, his followers, oh, they were pretty nasty, what I saw on the street, but still, most of them are mighty nice, clean-cut young fellows. Seeing Buzz and listening to what he actually says does kind of surprise you, kind of make you think. But what Mr. Windrip actually had said, Doremus could not remember an hour later when he had come out of the trance. He was so convinced then that Windrip would win that on Tuesday evening he did not remain at the Informer office until the returns were all in. But if he did not stay for the evidence of election, they came to him. Passed his house after midnight through muddy snow and tramped a triumphant and reasonably drunken parade carrying torches and bellowing to the air of Yankee Doodle new words revealed just that week by Mrs. Adelaide Targimich. "The snakes disloyal to our Buzz were riding on a rail. They'll wish to God they never was when we get them in jail. Buzz and keep it up, to victory he's floated. You were most ungrateful pup unless for Buzz you voted. Every MM gets a whip to use upon some traitor, and every anti-Buzz we skip today will tend to later." Anti-Buzz, a word credited to Mrs. Gimmich, but more probably invented by Dr. Hector McGoblin, was to be extensively used by lady patriots as a term expressing such vicious disloyalty to the state as might call for the firing squad. Like Mrs. Gimmich's splendid synthesis Unkies for soldiers of the AEF, it never really caught on. Among the winter-coated paraders, Doremus and Sissy thought that they could make out Shad Ledoux, Eris Dilly, that philoprogenitive squatter from Mount Terror, Charlie Betts, the furniture dealer, and Tony Mogliani, the fruit seller, most ardent expounder of Italian fascism in central Vermont. And though he could not be sure of it in the dimness behind the torches, Doremus rather thought that the lone large motor car following the procession was that of his neighbor, Francis Tasbro. Next morning, at the Informer office, Doremus did not learn of so very much damage wrought by the triumphant Nordics. They had merely upset a couple of privies, torn down and burned the tailor shop sign of Louis Rottenstern, and somewhat badly beaten Clifford Little, the jeweler, a slight, curly-headed young man whom Shad Ledoux despised because he organized theatricals and played the organ in Mr. Falk's church. That night, Doremus found on his front porch a notice in red chalk upon butcher's paper. "You will get yours, Dory, sweetheart, unless you get right down on your belly and crawl in front of the MM and the League and the Chief and I." Signed, a friend. It was the first time that Doremus had heard the Chief, a sound American variant of the leader, or the head of government as a popular title for Mr. Winthrop, it was soon to be made official. Doremus burned the red warning without telling his family, but he often woke to remember it, not very laughingly. End of chapter 12. It Can't Happen Here, chapter 13. And when I get ready to retire, I'm going to build me an up-to-date bungalow in some lovely resort, not in Como or any of the provincial Greek islands, you can be sure, but in somewheres like Florida, California, Santa Fe, and etc., and devote myself just to reading the classics like Longfellow, James Whitcomb Riley, Lord Macaulay, Henry Van Dyke, Elbert Hubbard, Plato, Hiawatha, and etc. Some of my friends laugh at me for it, but I've always cultivated a taste for the finest in literature. I got it from my mother, as I did everything that some people have been so good as to admire in me. From 0 Hour by Basilius Winthrop. Certain though Doremus had been of Winthrop's election, the event was like the long-dreaded passing of a friend. All right, hell with this country if it's like that. All these years I've worked, and I never did want to be on all these committees and boards and charity drives, and don't they look silly now. What I always wanted to do was sneak off to an ivory tower, or anyway, celluloid, imitation ivory, and read everything I've been too busy to read, thus Doremus in late November. And he did actually attempt it, and for a few days reveled in it, avoiding everyone save his family and Lorinda, Buck Titus, and Father Perfix. Mostly, though, he found that he did not relish the classics he had so far missed, but those familiar to his youth, Ivanhoe, Huckleberry Finn, Midsummer Night's Dream, The Tempest, L'Allegro, The Way of All Flesh, not quite so youthful there, Moby Dick, The Earthly Paradise, St. Agnes Eve, The Idols of the King, most of Swinburne, Pride and Prejudice, Religio Medici, Vanity Fair. Probably he was not so very different from President-elect Winthrop in his rather uncritical reverence toward any book he had heard of before he was 30. No American whose fathers have lived in the country for over 2 generations is so utterly different from any other American. In one thing, Doremus' literary escapism failed him thoroughly. He tried to relearn Latin, but he could not now, uncajoled by a master, believe that mensa, mensae, mensa, mensem, and mensa, all that idiotic a table, of a table, to a table, toward a table, at, in, by, or on a table, could bear him again, as it once had to the honey-sweet tranquility of Virgil on the Sabine farm. Then he saw that in everything his quest failed him. The reading was good enough, toothsome, satisfying, except that he felt guilty at having sneaked away to an ivory tower at all. Too many years he had made a habit of social duty. He wanted to be in things, and he was daily more irritable as Winthrop began, even before his inauguration, to dictate to the country. Buzz's party, with the desertions of the Jeffersonians, had less than a majority in Congress. Inside dope came from Doremus, from Washington, that Winthrop was trying to buy, to flatter, to blackmail opposing congressmen. A president-elect was unhallowed power, if he so wishes, and Winthrop, no doubt with promises of abnormal favors in the way of patronage, won over a few. 5 Jeffersonian congressmen had their elections challenged. One sensationally disappeared, and smoking after his galloping heels there was a devilish fume of embezzlements. And with each such triumph of Winthrop, all the well-meaning cloistered Doremuses of the country were the more anxious. All through the Depression, ever since 1929, Doremus had felt the insecurity, the confusion, the sense of futility in trying to do anything more permanent than shaving or eating breakfast that was general to the country. He could no longer plan for himself or for his dependents as the citizens of this once unsettled country had planned since 1620. Why, their whole lives had been predicated on the privilege of planning. Depressions had been only cyclic storms, certain to end in sunshine. Capitalism and parliamentary government were eternal and eternally being improved by the honest votes of good citizens. Doremus's grandfather, Calvin, Civil War veteran and ill-paid, illiberal congregational minister, had yet planned. My son Loren shall have a theological education, and I think we shall be able to build a fine new house in 15 or 20 years. that had given him a reason for working and a goal. His father, Lauren, had vowed, "Even if I have to economize on books a little and perhaps give up this extravagance of eating meat 4 times a week, very bad for the digestion, anyway, my son, Doremus, shall have a college education, and when, as he desires, he becomes a publicist, I think perhaps I shall be able to help him for a year or two. And then I hope, in a mere 5 or 6 years more, to buy that complete Dickens with all the illustrations. An extravagance, but a thing to leave to my grandchildren to treasure forever." But Remus Jessup could not plan. "I'll have Sissy go to Smith before she studies architecture, or if Julian, Falk, and Sissy get married and stick here in the fort, I'll give 'em the southwest lot, and someday, maybe 15 years from now, the whole place will be filled with nice kids again. No, 15 years from now," he sighed, "Sissy might be hustling hash for the sort of workers who called the waiters' art hustling hash, and Julian might be in the concentration camp, fascist or communist." The Horatio Alger tradition, from rags to Rockefellers, was clean gone out of the America it had dominated. It seemed faintly silly to hope, to try to prophesy, to give up sleep on a good mattress for toil on a typewriter, and as for saving money, idiotic. And for a newspaper editor, for one who must know, at least as well as the encyclopedia, everything about local and foreign history, geography, economics, politics, literature, and methods of playing football, it was maddening that it seemed impossible now to know anything surely. "He don't know what it's all about," had in a year or two changed from a colloquial sneer to a sound general statement regarding almost any economist. Once, modestly enough, Doremus had assumed that he had a decent knowledge of finance, taxation, the gold standard, agricultural exports, and he had smilingly pontificated everywhere that liberal capitalism would pastorally lead into state socialism, with government ownership of mines and railroads and water power, so settling all inequalities of income that every lion of a structured steel worker would be willing to lie down with any lamb of a contractor, and all the jails and tuberculosis sanatoria would be clean empty. Now he knew that he knew nothing fundamental, and like a lone monk stricken with a conviction of sin, he mourned, "If only I knew more, yes, and if I could only remember statistics." The coming and going of the NRA, the FERA, the PWA, and all the rest had convinced Doremus that there were 4 sets of people who did not clearly understand anything whatever about how the government must be conducted. All of the authorities in Washington, all of the citizenry who talked or wrote profusely about politics, the bewildered untouchables who said nothing, and Doremus Jessup. "But," said he, "now after Buzz's inauguration, everything is going to be completely simple and comprehensible again. The country is going to be run as his private domain." Julian Falk, now sophomore in Amherst, had come home for Christmas vacation, and he dropped in at the Informer office to beg for Doremus a ride home before dinner. He called Doremus Sir, and did not seem to think he was a comic fossil. Doremus liked it. On the way, they stopped for gasoline at the garage of John Polycop, and the seething Social Democrat, and were waited upon by Carl Pascal, sometimes donkey engine man at the Tasbro quarry, sometimes strike leader, sometime political prisoner in the county jail on a thin charge of inciting to riot, and ever since then a model of communistic piety. Pascal was a thin man, but sinewy. His gaunt and humorous face of a good mechanic was so grease-darkened that the skin above and below his eyes seemed white as a fish belly, and, in turn, that pallid rim made his eyes, alert, dark, gypsy eyes, seem the larger, a panther chained to a coal cart. "Well, what are you going to do after this election?" said Doremus. "Oh, that's a fool question. I guess none of us chronic kickers want to say much about what we plan to do after January when Buzz gets his hands on us. Lie low, eh?" "I'm going to lie low, the lowest lie that I ever did. You bet. But maybe there'll be a few communist cells around here when fascism begins to get into people's hair. Never did have much success with my propaganda before, but now you watch," exulted Pascal. "You don't seem so depressed by the election," marveled Doremus, while Julian offered, "No, you seem quite cheerful about it." "Depressed? Why, good Lord, Mr. Jessup, I thought you knew your revolutionary tactics better than that. way you supported us in the quarry strike, even if you are the perfect type of small capitalist bourgeois. Depressed. Why, can't you see if the communists had paid for it, they couldn't have anything more elegant for our purposes than the election of a pro-plutocrat, itching militarist dictator like Buzz Windrip? Look, he'll get everybody plenty dissatisfied, but they can't do anything barehanded against the armed troops. Then he'll whoop it up for a war, and so millions of people will have arms and food rations in their hands, all ready for revolution. Hooray for Buzz and John Prang the Baptist. Carl, it's funny about you. I honestly believe you believe in communism, marveled young Julian. Don't you? Why don't you go and ask your friend Father Perfix if he believes in the Virgin? But you seem to like America, and you don't seem so fanatical, Carl. I remember when I was a kid of about 10, and you, I suppose you were about 25 or 6 then. You used to slide with us and whoop like hell, and you made me a ski stick. Sure, I like America. Came here when I was 2 years old. I was born in Germany. My folks weren't Heinies, though. My dad was French, and my mother a hunky from Serbia. Guess that makes me 100% American, all right. I think we've got the old country beat lots of ways. Why, say, Julian, over there, I'd have to call you Mynheer, or Your Excellency, or some fool thing, and you'd call me, Pascal. And Mr. Jessup here, my lord, he'd be a commendatore, or Herr Doctor. No, I like it here. They're symptoms of possible future democracy, but what burns me up, it isn't the old soapboxer's chestnut about how 0.1% of the population at the top have an aggregate income equal to the 42% at the bottom. Figures like that are too astronomical, don't mean a thing in the world to a fellow with his eyes and nose down in the transmission box, fellow that doesn't see that stars except after 9 p.m. on odd Wednesdays. But what burns me up is the fact that even before this depression, in what you folks call prosperous times, 7% of all the families in the country earned $500 a year or less. Remember, those weren't the unemployed on relief. Those were the guys that had the honor of still doing honest labor. $500 a year is $10 a week, and that means one dirty little room for a family of 4 people. It means $5 a week for all their food, 18 cents per day per person per food. And even the lousiest prisons allow more than that. And the magnificent remainder of $2.50 a week, that means 9 cents per day per person for clothes, insurance, car fares, doctor's bills, dentist bills, and for God's sake, amusements, and all the rest of the 9 cents a day they can fritter away on their Fords and autogyros, and when they feel fagged skipping across the pond on the Normandy. 7% of all the fortunate American families where the old man has got a job. Julian was silent, then whispered, You know, fellow gets discussing economics in college theoretically sympathetic, but to see your own kids living on 18 cents a day for grub, I guess that would make a man pretty extremist. Dreamus fretted, But what percentage of forced labor in your Russian lumber camps and Siberian prison mines are getting more than that? Ha! That's all baloney. That's the old standard comeback at every communist, just like once, 20 years ago, the muttonheads used to think they'd crushed any socialist when they'd snickered. If all the money was divided up inside 5 years, the hustlers would have all of it again. Probably there's some standard coup de grace like that in Russia to crush anybody that defends America. Besides, Karl Pascal glowed with nationalistic fervor, we Americans aren't like those dumb Ruski peasants. We'll do a whole lot better when we get communism. And on that, his employer, the expansive John Polycop, a woolly Scotch terrier of a man, returned to the garage. John was an excellent friend of Dreamus, had indeed been his bootlegger all through Prohibition, personally running in his whiskey from Canada. He had been known, even in that singularly scrupulous profession, as one of its most trustworthy practitioners. Now he flowered into mid-European dialectics. Evening, Mr. Jessup. Evening, Julian. Carl, fill your tank for you. You want to watch that guy? He's likely to hold out a gallon on you. He's one of those crazy dogs, the communists. They all believe in violence instead of evolution and legality. Them, why say, if they hadn't been so crooked, they'd have joined me and Norman Thomas and the other intelligent socialists in a united front with Roosevelt and the Jeffersonians. Why say, we'd have licked the pants off of Buzzard Windrip. Windrip and his plans. Buzzard Windrip, that was good, Dreamus reflected. He'd be able to use it in the Informer. Pascal protested. Not that Buzzard's personal plans and ambitions have got much to do with it. Altogether too easy to explain everything, just blaming it on the Windrip. Why don't you read your Marx, John, instead of just always gassing about 'em? Why, Windrip's just something nasty that's been vomited up. Plenty others still left fermenting in the stomach. Quack economist with every sort of economic ptomaine. No, Buzz isn't important. It's the sickness that made us throw 'em up, and we've got to attend to. The sickness of more than 30% permanently unemployed and growing larger. Got to cure it. Tavarisches cure it, snapped Polycop. And do you think communism will cure it? Skeptically wondered Doremus, and more politely, do you really think Karl Marx had the dope? Worried Julian, all three at once. You bet your life we can, said Pascal vaingloriously. As Doremus, driving away, looked back at them, Pascal and Polycop were removing a flat tire together and quarreling bitterly, quite happily. Doremus's attic study had been to him a refuge from the tender solicitudes of Emma and Mrs. Candy and his daughters, and all the impulsive handshaking strangers who wanted the local editor to start off their campaigns for the sale of life insurance, or gas-saving carburetors for the Salvation Army, or the Red Cross, or the Orphans' Home, or the Anti-Cancer Crusade, or the assorted magazines which would enable to go through college young men who at all costs should be kept out of college. It was a refuge now from the considerably less tender solicitudes of supporters of the president-elect. On the pretense of work, Doremus took to sneaking up there in mid-evening and sat not in an easy chair, but stiffly at his desk, making crosses and 5-pointed stars and 6-pointed stars and fancy delete signs on sheets of yellow copy paper while he sorely meditated. Thus this evening, after the demands of Karl Pascal and John Polycop, the revolt against civilization. But there's the worst trouble of this whole cursed business of analysis. When I get to defending democracy against communism and fascism and whatnot, I sound just like the Lothrop Stoddards. Why, I sound almost like a Hearst editorial on how some college has got to kick out a dangerous red instructor in order to preserve our democracy for the ideals of Jefferson and Washington. Yet somehow, singing the same words, I have a notion my tune is entirely different from Hearst's. I don't think we've done very well with all the plowland and forest and minerals and husky human stock we've had. What makes me sick about Hearst and the DAR is that if they are against communism, I have to be for it. And I don't want to be. Wastage of resources, so they're about gone. That's been the American share in the revolt against civilization. We can go back to the Dark Ages. The crust of learning and good manners and tolerance is so thin. It would just take a few thousand big shells and gas bombs to wipe out all the eager young men and all the libraries and historical archives and patent offices, all the laboratories and art galleries, all the castles and Periclean temples and Gothic cathedrals, all the cooperative stores and motor factories, every storehouse of learning. No inherent reason why Sissy's grandchildren, or if anybody's grandchildren, will survive at all. Shouldn't be living in caves and heaving rocks at catamounts. And what's the solution of preventing this debacle? Plenty of them. The communists have a patent solution they know will work. So have the fascists and the rigid American constitutionalists who call themselves advocates of democracy without any notion what the word ought to mean, and the monarchists who are certain that if we could just resurrect the Kaiser and the Tsar and King Alfonso, everybody would be loyal and happy again, and the banks would simply force credit on small businessmen at 2%. And all the preachers, they tell you, that they alone have the inspired solution. Well, gentlemen, I have to listen to all your solutions, and I now inform you that I, and I alone, except perhaps for Walt Trowbridge and the ghost of Loretto, have the perfect and inevitable, the only solution, and that is, there is no solution. There will never be a state or society anything like perfect. There will never be a time when there won't be a large proportion of people who feel poor no matter how much they have and envy their neighbors who know how to wear cheap clothes showily and envy neighbors who can dance or make love or digest better. Doremus suspected that with the most scientific state it would be impossible for iron deposits always to find themselves exactly the rate decided upon 2 years before by the National Technocratic Minerals Commission, no matter how elevated and fraternal and utopian the principles of the commissioners. His solution, Dreamus pointed out, was the only one that did not flee before the thought that 1,000 years from now human beings would probably continue to die of cancer and earthquake and such clownish mishaps as slipping in bathtubs. It presumed that mankind would continue to be burdened with eyes that grow weak, feet that grow tired, noses that itch, intestines vulnerable to bacilli, and generative organs that are nervous until the age of virtue and senility. It seemed to him unidealistically probable for all the contemporary furniture of the 1930s that most people would continue, at least for a few hundred years, to sit in chairs, eat from dishes upon tables, read books no matter how many cunning phonographic substitutes might be invented, wear shoes or sandals, sleep in beds, write with some sort of pens, and in general spend 20 or 22 hours a day, much as they had spent them in the 1930 and in 1630. He suspected that tornadoes, floods, droughts, lightning, and mosquitoes would remain, along with the homicidal tendency known in the best citizens when their sweethearts go dancing off with other men. And most fatally and abysmally, his solution guessed that men of superior cunning, of slyer foxiness, whether they might be called comrades, brethren, commissars, kings, patriots, little brothers of the poor, or any other rosy name, would continue to have more influence than slower-witted men, however worthy. All the warring solutions except his, Doremus chuckled, were ferociously propagated by the fanatics, the nuts. He recalled an article in which Neil Carruthers asserted that the rabble-rousers of America in the mid-30s had a long and dishonorable ancestry of prophets who had felt called upon to stir up the masses to save the world, and save it in the prophet's own way, and do it right now and most violently. Peter the Hermit, the ragged, mad, stinking monk who, to rescue unidentified tomb of the Savior from undefined outrages by the pagans, led out on the crusade some hundreds of thousands of European peasants to die on the way of starvation after burning, raping, and murdering fellow peasants in foreign villages all along the road. There was John Ball, who, in 1381, was a share-the-wealth advocate. He preached equality of wealth, the abolition of class distinctions, and what would now be called communism, and whose follower, Wat Tyler, looted London, with the final gratifying result that afterward Labour was, by the frightened government, more oppressed than ever. And nearly 300 years later, Cromwell's methods of expounding the sweet winsomeness of purity and liberty were shooting, slashing, clubbing, starving, and burning people, and after him the workers paid for the spree of bloody righteousness with blood. Brooding about it, fishing in the muddy slough of recollection which most Americans have in place of a clear pool of history, Doremus was able to add other names of well-meaning rabble-rousers, Marat and Danton and Robespierre, who helped shift the control of France from the moldy aristocrats to the stuffy, centime-pinching shopkeepers, Lenin and Trotsky, who gave to the illiterate Russian peasants the privileges of punching a time clock and of being as learned, gay, and dignified as the factory hands in Detroit, and Lenin's man, Borodin, who extended this boon to China, and that William Randolph Hearst, who in 1898 was the Lenin of Cuba and switched the mastery of the Golden Isle from the cruel Spaniards to the peaceful, unarmed, brotherly-loving Cuban politicians of today. The American Moses Dowie and his theocracy at Zion City, Illinois, where the only results of the direct leadership of God, as directed and encouraged by Mr. Dowie and by his even more spirited successor, Mr. Voliva, were that the holy denizens were deprived of oysters and cigarettes and cursing and died without the aid of doctors instead of with it, and that the stretch of road through Zion City incessantly caused the breakage of springs on the cars of citizens from Evanston, Wilmette, and Winnetka, which may or may not have been a desirable good deed. Cecil Rhodes, his vision of making South Africa a British paradise, and the actuality of making it a graveyard for British soldiers. All the utopias, Brook Farm, Robert Owen's Sanctuary of Chatter, Upton Sinclair's Helicon Hall, and their regulation, end in scandal, feuds, poverty, griminess, disillusion. All the leaders of Prohibition, so certain that their cause was world regenerating that for it they were willing to shoot down violators. It seemed to Doremus that the only rabble-rouser to build permanently had been Brigham Young, with his bearded Mormon captains, who not only turned the Utah desert into an Eden, but made it pay and kept it up. Pondered Doremus Blessed be they who are not patriots and idealists, and who do not feel they must dash right in and do something about it, something so immediately important that all doubters must be liquidated, tortured, slaughtered. Good old murder, that since the slaying of Abel by Cain has always been the new device by which all oligarchies and dictators have, for all future ages to come, removed opposition. In this acid mood, Doremus doubted the efficacy of all revolutions, dared even a little to doubt our two American revolutions against England in 1776 and the Civil War. For a New England editor to contemplate even the smallest criticism of these wars was what it would have been for a Southern Baptist fundamentalist preacher to question immortality, the inspiration of the Bible, and the ethical value of shouting Hallelujah. Yet had it, Doremus queried nervously, been necessary to have had 4 years of inconceivably murderous civil war, followed by 20 years of commercial oppression of the South in order to preserve the Union, free the slaves, and establish the equality of industry with agriculture? Had it been just to the Negroes themselves to throw them so suddenly, with so little preparation, into full citizenship, and that the Southern states, in what they considered self-defense, disqualified them at the polls and lynched them and lashed them? Could they not, as Lincoln at first desired and planned, to have been freed without the vote, then gradually and competently educated under federal guardianship, so that by 1890 they might, without too much enmity, have been able to enter fully into all the activities of the land? A generation and a half, Doremus meditated, of the sturdiest and most gallant killed or crippled in the Civil War, or perhaps worst of all, becoming garrulous professional heroes and satellites of politicians who, in return for their solid vote, made all lazy jobs safe for the GAR. The most valorous, it was they who suffered the most. For a while, the John D. Rockefellers, the J.P. Morgans, the Vanderbilts, Astors, Golds, and all their nimble financial comrades of the South did not enlist, but stayed in the warm, dry counting house, drawing the fortune of the country into their webs. It was Jeb Stuart, Stonewall Jackson, Nathaniel Lyon, Pat Claiborne, and the knightly James P. McPherson who were killed, and with them Abraham Lincoln. So with the hundreds of thousands who should have been the progenitors of new American generations drained away, we could show the world, which from 1780 to 1860 had so admired men like Franklin, Jefferson, Washington, Hamilton, the Adamses, Webster, only such salvages as McKinley, Benjamin Harrison, William Jennings Bryan, Harding, and Senator Berzelius Winthrop and his rivals. Slavery had been a cancer, and in that day was known no remedy save bloody cutting. There had been no x-rays of wisdom and tolerance, yet to sentimentalize this cutting, to justify and rejoice in it, was an altogether evil thing. A national superstition was later to lead to other unavoidable wars. Wars to free Cubans, to free Filipinos who didn't want our brand of freedom, to end all wars. Let us, thought Doremus, not throb again to the bugles of the Civil War, nor find diverting the gallantry of Sherman's dashing Yankee boys and burning the houses of lone women, nor particularly admire the calmness of General Lee as he watched thousands writhe in the mud. He even wondered if, necessarily, it had been such a desirable thing for the 13 colonies to have cut themselves off from Great Britain. Had the United States remained in the British Empire, possibly there would have evolved a confederation that could have enforced world peace instead of talking about it. Boys and girls from the western ranches and southern plantations and northern maple groves might have added Oxford and York Minster and Devonshire villages to their own domain. Englishmen and even virtuous English women might have learned that persons who lack the accent of a Kentish rectory or a Yorkshire textile village may yet in many ways be literate, and that astonishing numbers of persons in the world cannot be persuaded that their chief aim in life ought to be to increase British exports on behalf of the stock holdings of the better classes. It is commonly asserted, Doremus remembered, that without complete political independence the United States could not have developed its own peculiar virtues. Yet it was not apparent to him that America was any more individual than Canada or Australia, that Pittsburgh and Kansas City were to be preferred before Montreal and Melbourne, Sydney and Vancouver. No questioning of the eventual wisdom of the radicals who had first advocated these two American revolutions, Doremus warned himself, should be allowed to give any comfort to that eternal enemy, the conservative manipulators of privilege who damn as dangerous agitators any man who menaces their fortunes, who jump in their chairs at the sting of a gnat like Debs and blandly swallow a camel like Windrip. Between the rabble-rousers, chiefly to be detected by desire for their own personal power and notoriety, and the unself-seeking fighters against tyranny, between William Walker or Danton or John Howard or William Lloyd Garrison, Doremus saw there was the difference between a noisy gang of thieves and an honest man noisily defending himself against thieves. He had been brought up to revere the abolitionists, Lovejoy, Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Harriet Beecher Stowe, though his father had considered John Brown insane and a menace, and had been thrown sly mud at the marble statues of Harry Ward Beecher, the apostle in the fancy vest. And Doremus could not do otherwise than revere the abolitionists now, though he wondered if Stephen Douglas and Thaddeus Stevens and Lincoln, more cautious and less romantic men, might not have done the job better. Is it just possible, he sighed, that the most vigorous and boldest idealists have been the worst enemies of human progress instead of its greatest creators? Possible that plain men with the humble trait of minding their own business will rank higher in the heavenly hierarchy than all the plumed souls who have shoved their way in among the masses and insisted on saving them? End of chapter 13.